So I've been living in Tel Aviv for many years now, and as an architect, I've been always fascinated by buildings' appearance. Walking down the streets of the city, I was looking at buildings thinking, why do they look the way they do? Now, as we all probably know, Tel Aviv is famous for its white and Bauhaus architecture of the 1930s, and its gray and functional architecture of the following decades. These buildings are modern, very clean. Every detail is exactly where it should be. But then, in between those white and gray jewels of modernism, I noticed a very different kind of architecture. Buildings that were colorful, weird-looking, flamboyant, some might even call them ugly. Now, in trying to understand why they came into being the shape they are, I was looking for a common link, and quickly I found out that all of them were built from a specific point in time. It was the mid-1980s. But why? Why have Tel Aviv's architecture changed so radically at that point? Now, looking for answers, I naturally turned to the architects themselves, asking them what do they think have happened. Now, they all answered quite a similar answer, that they graduated from the Technion at the 80s and grew tired of their teachers' modernistic dogma. So they had to rely on their own aesthetic ideology and self-expression and come up with new designs that were influenced by Western contemporary styles. But since they were still very young architects, they couldn't really realize their architecture yet, so they were just sketching and dreaming about their ideas. Tzvi Harel, for example, he was sketching sarcastic architectural cartoons for the local newspaper in the 80s. This one, for example, he criticized the new pastiche villas of the suburbs, offering to pile the villas up and make a tower out of them and put it back in the city center. Simona Barsagi, who was just tired of the gray and dull residential boxes of the city, and she wanted to revive the rounded balcony of the Bauhaus, but with a staggering look. Now, I wasn't really convinced by their stylistic reasoning. I felt that such a huge change deserves a better answer. It was as if there was an elephant in the room, and that's an actual elephant that was in the actual room of in one of my interviews. So now, I don't know why. Now, as an architectural historian, I was looking for the broader historical picture. What happened exactly at the same time as the architects started realizing their architecture? It wasn't that hard to find, as in 1948, Israel was on the verge of an economic collapse. Following a decade of its worst ever economic recession and political unrest, people called it the lost decade. Just imagine that today we are going all crazy about the inflation rate of 4%. In 1984, it was above 400%. People were losing their savings and unemployment rocketed. But still, what is the connection between my odd-looking building and this story? So to find out about this link with architectural form and economic crisis, I went to the literature. But disappointingly, I found out that it was mostly concentrated on questions of style and ideology, much like the architects I interviewed. So going back to my case study, I realized I had to come up with that link myself. Now, in the 80s, we see Tel Aviv in a state of disrepair, as already from the 60s, it suffered from a massive depopulation as 20% of its inhabitants moved to the near and far suburbs, leaving mostly the elderly behind. The city was emptying out, and the buildings were falling apart. Now, up until that point, I was conducting a rather conventional economic research. I was interviewing the architects, I was going through their archives, I examined images, I read the newspapers of the period. I even co-authored a book about this period, its architecture and its architects. Yet, this method was insufficient to explain such a huge economic change. I felt I needed to go deeper and understand the economy of construction, and specifically in Tel Aviv. Looking for data, specific and accurate data about this period, I couldn't find much. So I diverged into the field of digital humanities and started recreating my own data. I digitized raw data that I found in the municipal taxation department, the Arnona, and no one really used before, to get the exact location and volume of each of the 3,000 buildings that were built in Tel Aviv from the 70s to the 90s. This way I could redraw the economic historical reality of the city year by year. To the left, we see a snapshot of Tel Aviv in 75. The red dots indicates the constructed buildings and their location in the city, and the darker the blue areas are, meaning higher volume of built floor area in square meters. In 85, we can see the recession, as only quarter of the city's construction economy was in play. In here, I counted how many buildings were built in each year in the city, and the recession is apparent again, as in 1971, we have almost 400 buildings, as in 1986, we have less than 100 buildings built in the entire city. Now we can also see the changes coming, a recovery, and you probably already guessed it all started at the end of 1985. On July of that year, the government drafted or agreed upon a revolutionary emergency plan to stabilize the economy. It meant that the entire economy of Israel will shift towards neoliberalism, and it also meant, among other things, the privatization of social infrastructure. What it meant to architecture is that the government will reduce their public construction money, which completely redesigned the economy of the architectural field. So now that I had the bigger picture, I could look back and carefully drafting my interpretation of Tel Aviv's architectural change. So let's recap. Even before the 80s, there were fewer and fewer people in the city, meaning no new buildings. Architects were then left unemployed, dreaming and sketching their ideas. These new ideas would then merge with the recovery of the markets in 1985, with new money coming in, and the need to draw the people back into the city. Now imagine you are a young architect and you're getting your first ever commission to build a building after a decade of recession. What do? You do the most amazing, extravagant, colorful building you could ever think of. It was in your drawer. You build this building should show off your skill and creativity, but it should also function as a marketing tool for the developers. So you could say that economic factors played a crucial role in disrupting professional conventions, promoting the development of innovative and experimental architecture that was carried out by young and inexperienced architects that were quick to adapt to the new constraints. So now let's see how it worked on the ground. Remember Simona Barsagi, who was tired of the gray, oh, you can't see it, who was tired of the gray and dull boxes of the city? Well, we'll try and show you that. She was... Maybe. Yeah. She imagined her buildings, she imagined her buildings as precious jewels over the monotonous necklace of the street. And here is an example. I hope you could hear that. Um, well, she wasn't only dreaming, though, and she actually built more than a couple hundreds of these buildings all over Tel Aviv. It's okay. Um, while the developers could charge up to 30% more on each of her neo-Bauhaus apartments. Sorry for that. And remember Tzvi, who couldn't imagine that a couple years after drafting this caricature, a developer would come over and ask him to build this building on the promenade of Tel Aviv. But that's exactly what happened. He was also asked that each room would have a sea view and that no two floors would look the same, which complicated this mess even more. Now, to conclude, you might still think that these buildings are weird, too colorful, flamboyant, you might even call them ugly. But these could not have been any other way. They were designed as economic and marketing tools on a mission to resuscitate the city and its economy. And only by revealing their specific economic context, we might discover that they were in fact architectures of survival. And what I wanted to show or to convey in this short presentation is that reading architecture as a historic artifact could teach us to reappreciate our built environment, which will in turn inform us about our own culture. Thank you. And I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Elad. Wow.
That wasn't easy.
Thank you, Elad, for this great presentation and amazing story.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you can link your evolution in this story on the conclusion of these flamboyant buildings to the evolution of how buildings are today being built or were built in the past decade, in the in the sense of how the economic boom and a marketing boom even in Tel Aviv, but maybe also in Israel, are being built and totally changed in perspective.
Yeah. That's of course a good question because it brings us to the future, to the future and the present. However, I would love not to answer this question, I think. As an architectural historian, even this period is too new to survey and to understand. When I approached the architects a couple years ago, asking them, can you tell me about the buildings you made? They were like, what? I'm still alive. Why are you asking me questions like a historian? So I think let's talk in 20 years. I'm sure we'll stay in touch. And think about what is the Tama 38, how does it affecting us, how economy affected that. I think it's much easier to see the effects of economy on architecture today. They all look like Excel sheets, which these were completely the opposite. So maybe that's a hint for the future.
Hi, thanks, Omer, Anthropology University. Just two quick questions. I'm really convinced by your thesis, but I want to expand it a bit more and ask you about things that's happening in the 70s and the 80s in Israel. And first question is how Cold War atmosphere might change the perspective or the orientation of architects from maybe European influences and toward maybe more American influences, yes. And if you can see it in your research. And the second question, is there any difference in technology that comes up in the 80s and allow more possibilities to think of buildings or to illustrate buildings?
So
Thanks.
I'll answer the second question again. It's easier. Technology is, of course, playing a crucial role in here. The 80s, or let's say opening the markets and the dollar exchange and all these economic tools that were opening up in the 80s brought a lot of new materials and technologies in Israel. This is part of the reasons I didn't go much into the really design aspect, but this is part of the reason we see those stones. These are stones. Most of them are stones. There's some aluminum, but these are all new materials that started coming from other places, and they were cheaper. They were actually cheaper than the architecture that they knew before, which actually fit to the economic situation or the growing economic situation of that time. So you might think that these buildings are more expensive, but no, they're actually cheaper. The first question is much broader, of course, question maybe to answer here, but of course there was a huge shift. I don't know, I wouldn't frame it exactly as the Cold War, but I would frame it as the demise of the semi-socialist state of Israel. Started already in the 60s, of course, but the influences of socialist architecture diminished as time went by, and I think the 70s and the beginning of the 80s are very crucial, as I referred in your question, because this is where it all percolated. People were starting to go abroad, people started to have magazines. The architects always told me about this, the shiny magazines they saw, and the architecture, the postmodern architecture of the United States that just was starting to show, and they wanted that. They wanted a new thing. They were tired of the concrete, you know, the gray, as I said, the gray and functional architecture of socialism. So that's maybe a part of the answer.
Hi, Alon, Tel Aviv. As you know, I think it's really fascinating, and you gave kind of a Marxist explanation, right? It's the economy, stupid. Yeah. But then the question is, the neo-Marxist question is, where's the ideology? So it connects to almost question in what ways were the decisions to build those buildings, and not just to change from what happened already, but the styles that they chose in the end. How was that shaped beyond just what was available to them in regards to market and the production cost, and etc.?
I'm sorry if there are any architects in the room, but ideology is a very big thing for architects. It's too big for architects.
Okay.
For practicing architects, I'm sorry, scholars. But again, I talked to, I don't know, a couple dozens architects for that research, for that initial stage. And ideology wasn't really part of the equation. When I say ideology, I mean that, let's say, my field of architectural history is referring or is inferring ideology from these buildings. A lot of them had aesthetic ideology, let's say in brackets. But they looked at architecture, they came from far, but they also, and I didn't refer to that, and I don't even show picture of that, but when I say this architecture from the 80s and 90s, there is a whole big chunk of architecture that I didn't show or refer to, which is the starting of conservation, the understanding of history, historicism we call it, which is, let's say, if we want to call it an ideology, we would say localism, okay? I think that what the 80s brought us, that's got to do a lot with philosophy and other streams of ideas that were flourishing in that, at that period. I don't remember your question anymore, but I hope I answered something. Just flow of...
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
You just made a distinction between a practicing architect and a scholar architect.
Yes.
I would like to ask, how is your research falls into whatever you aspire to be? And if it's on the scholar side, what are you trying to provide for practicing architects? Are you trying to provide them a warning not to build this kind of stuff, or a context, build this kind of stuff in order to achieve this and that? What are you trying to achieve with your research in the applicative aspect of architecture?
So the first sub-question was about what do I want to do. So actually my dream is, you know, the new building of, it's not already new already, but the new section of the Israel Tel Aviv Museum, no, the Tel Aviv Museum. It was built by an architect, which that was his kind of first really public, really big building. He was like in his late 50s. This is what I want to do. That's for that. Until then, I want to be a scholar. And what is the giveaway, or what is the architect should take? I think that I already saw this process with architects I worked with, and it's been, I think I'm working on that research since 2015, more or less. And I see that architects are looking back, and I think this is what I would love them to do, and I'm doing that with them. A lot of them at first was pushing back, like, why do you care about us, first of all, and second of all, don't call us postmodern. Postmodernism is a kind of a bad thing to say about in the architectural world, at least. So eventually, years after year of talking to them and looking at their work, I think they are better in understanding what they did, and I hope it reflects on their future architecture. So,
Elad, you've been fascinating. There's still a lot of questions, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go around to the hands that were up. They'll ask the question and try to remember as much as you can.
You see, I can't.
And then answer whatever questions you see relevant or most relevant and whatever you remember, okay?
I can just
So
talk.
Shachar,
Shachar Tel Aviv. I wanted to ask whether you, in any extent, compare like to similar post-recession trends in architectures in other countries, and if so, if there are like similarities and differences, unique traits to the Israeli case. That's my question.
Hi, sorry I'm participating in this raining questions on you. Daphne from Hebrew. So you discussed sort of like the hierarchies of power of like architects like turning on their heads together with this recession and economic situation. I'm interested if you discussed sort of money, salaries with architects, like also like the whole labor aspect of this Marxist theory, right? Like,
Yeah.
thanks.
hold it.
Hi, Elad.
Hi, Dan.
I was just wondering, do you think those buildings are ugly? And
Oh, yeah.
or are you claiming for a kind of aesthetic that derives from a Marxist position?
It's okay.
Just curious. Yeah.
One more.
And just answer very, very briefly.
Okay.
I'll be gentle. I just want to add on Shachar's question about how can you generalize, but not only on different countries in different time frames, but inside Israel in the 80s, do we expect to see the same effect in other cities, or it's just relevant for Tel Aviv?
All great questions.
But mine is the
Just
best.
for the record, Ohad also had a question, but you're in the next session together, so he'll ask you face to face.
I would pick up on the most flamboyant question. No, about do I think they're ugly? So when we published the book, the one I wrote with Jeremy Hoffman from the City Hall, I was shaking. It's like saying something kind of newish, and I didn't expect the reactions, which were generally, why do you say these buildings are ugly? They are beautiful. They're amazing. This is like, talkbacks and all that. This is what I received. We also cheated a little bit because we took a really, really good photographer to take all these pictures. So they might look beautiful. I think, personally, I cannot, they're like my kids now. If I see one on the streets and I'm walking with friends, they're all pomo. And I think they're fascinating, and I think this is why I like them. And I don't want to mention my other affair with the Central Bus Station. That's an ugly building. These are completely okay. More? Comparison is good because last year we had a convention in Technion, and we brought two scholars from Germany and Poland. And they talked about how postmodern architecture evolved in mostly in Eastern Europe. And the comparison was kind of, I wouldn't say it was perfect, but it was kind of amazing to see how, let's say, semi-socialist or post-socialist countries come out of these dark ages and finding out their new tools. And I've been in Hungary. There are some examples of really American crazy postmodern architecture, but but I think the pendulum is doing its thing. It's going to the extreme. Israel, I have to now to lessen maybe a little bit, but postmodernism in Israel is not that like crazy compared to other places. So in other places we see much crazier buildings, but I think again it doesn't matter. I think the story that they tell, this is the issue, and I could find a lot of similarities with ideology and the freedom. I didn't say the two words, that is freedom and individualism, that these are the words that the architects really used over and over again. So these are kind of similar. So that's nice.
Rotem told me to let you off the hook. Rotem, our well-being officer. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You were outstanding. Thank you.